Hello, and welcome to Tech Connects, Dice's podcast where we dig into topics on tech hiring, recruiting, and careers that matter to you. I'm your host, Nick Kolakowski, and today we're going to be talking about learning and development with Becky Wallace, Head of People at LearnUpon. As we'll get into, LearnUpon builds tools for employee training and learning. I wanted to talk to Becky because she's been involved in HR and tech for quite some time, including stints at Yahoo and Etsy. She has incredible insight into how learning and development programs can impact everything from employee morale to retention. Given how tech companies everywhere seem to be wrestling with exactly those issues at the moment, I thought it was critical to have this kind of discussion. So let's listen in. So Becky, thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really interested in speaking to you because there's a lot of conversation and buzz right now within the tech community, as I guess there always is to a certain extent, about training and engagement and so on, especially with an uncertain economy and a lot of companies looking to figure out the best ways to retain specialists, and also tech professionals looking to upgrade. But I guess, before we kick off all that complicated subject matter, for those in the audience who don't know, what exactly does LearnUpon do, and how does it tie into engagement and so on?
Sure. So we're a learning management software company. We are headquartered in Dublin, in Ireland. We've about 300 employees across the world, with offices in Dublin, obviously, Belgrade in Serbia, and then in the US we have offices in Salt Lake City and Philadelphia. And we then have offices as well in Sydney and in London as well. So lots of employees across the world. And so really, the core of us, we're focused on learning and development of either employees, members, and customers as well. So really depends on what you're looking to do and who you're looking to train and upskill. But we can, our platform provides that kind of service.
Okay, cool. And to that end, there's a lot of, if speaking from an employee or a tech professional perspective, occasionally you get those notices in your email that, you need to participate in training, or your manager might offer you the chance to, use some budget to go get a certification or take a class or something like that. But sort of looking at it from a company perspective, kind of what are the challenges that companies face in keeping their employees invested and engaged? Because I can imagine that from a company perspective, it can be, especially a company that does a lot of different things, that is a very difficult thing. So I'm just curious about what the challenges are there primarily.
Yes, I think there's been many challenges, particularly in the last few years with hybrid and remote working. It is hard to keep employees invested and engaged. In practical terms, I think the blurring of the lines between home life and work life has probably led to people feeling overwhelmed, overburdened, in some cases burnt out. And it can be hard to stay motivated when you're kind of expected to move at 100 kilometers every day. I think one big challenge is around communication. So I'd say, things move very quickly. When you're working in a remote or hybrid environment and you're not seeing people in the office every day, things happen, decisions are made in a meeting or in a Slack channel that you might not be a part of. And suddenly you can feel very kind of left out and undervalued if you haven't been part of the decision-making process. And that can definitely feel, lack of engagement from that. So I think another challenge that people see is around not living the company values or the company culture. So it's not enough to just say it. People notice what you do, not just what you say. So your behaviors have to really align with the culture code. And as a leader, that's really important to ensure that your people are invested in you and in the company and stay engaged as well. And then career development is obviously a big piece of the puzzle, right? Development has to be clear to people. They can feel less engaged and ultimately decide to leave if they don't feel that and see that development. So traditionally, I think people see development as moving up the career ladder into people management, but that growth path isn't for everybody either. And you also can have a team of managers, so you need to figure out different avenues for people so that they can kind of develop, and whether that's into a more senior position or into a different role within the team or the company.
That's actually an interesting and a huge issue in tech, because there's so many tech professionals who for decades, even if they wanted to stay as a specialist or a developer or whatever, would inevitably sort of find themselves forced into management, because that was just the one uni track that they were on. And now it seems that more companies are opening up and sort of dividing out between those who want to go on the management track and end up, leading a huge team or even the company, or at least the tech stack as CIO or whatever. And then the people who want to remain specialists, and so they become like a distinguished engineer. They don't have to manage anybody, but they just have to ensure that, for example, the AI programs, kind of stay up to date and kind of market leading. It does lead to a question, though. I mean, what you just suggested is, there's sort of there's two things. I mean, there's a lot of complexity kind of inherent there, and also you also see a lot of companies that will say, of course, we need to do all those things you just mentioned in terms of career development and things like that. But it seems like there's also a little bit of a gap where companies say the things, but then they don't actually kind of implement it. It makes me wonder, kind of, what are the practical steps that organizations can take to actively foster that culture of development? I mean, whether it's mentorship programs or upskilling or anything kind of along those lines. Like, what can they practically do? Because I think sometimes managers get stuck up on that part of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like HR people, we're terrible at underselling the amount of work that we're doing in these kind of areas. Chances are, people are doing more, companies are doing more than you think, but people might not categorize it or recognize it as career development. So I think, most companies, for example, have some level of internal mobility, and that's a great place to start, right? I think we are at LearnUpon, we're really actively engaged in upskilling our employees. Obviously, we have a wonderful platform that we're able to utilize ourselves, but it goes beyond that as well. We have to put the work in to it's not just about the platform; it's about what you put into it. So we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years creating that kind of clear pathway, and we've created a competency framework, so that we've kind of come up with 9 global competencies that we feel are important to all roles across LearnUpon. So that kind of takes into account then kind of the layer on top of that is about team specific needs as well, and skills. So we've identified kind of priority development areas within that career competency framework, and aligned our learning resources accordingly. So we've mapped in LinkedIn learning courses, for example, to our core competencies, and made them readily accessible on demand through our LMS. And we also kind of, I think a great thing to do is around piloting with smaller teams. So you can see, is something working before you kind of take it to the bigger organization. We're very lucky that we're about, less than 300 people. So it's quite easy to pilot smaller things across smaller teams before rolling out to the business. And I think that's really important as well. So that you're always learning as well, taking part in a pilot to help it be ultimately more successful when you are launching it to the rest of the company. So, one example that we've done recently is around a skills development pilot. And we wanted to take an approach that looks at personalized development plans, and tailored learning experience to individual needs, so that we're kind of targeting skill enhancement. So the first version we did with a couple of teams was around, focus on any skill, and choose any skill to focus on. We learned that time is kind of the biggest blocker there. And so if it's not a skill that you're focused on in the course of your working day, people aren't going to be able to look at it. So version 2 of the pilot was, to pick a skill that was relevant to the day-to-day job, so that they could kind of really work on that, because so much of learning is you kind of learn by doing, right? You can do courses and you can, all of that kind of, you can read articles and all that, but it's really like on the job learning that we see the best results from. So I think that's really important as well. Mentoring programs are also really helpful. We don't do it at LearnUpon at the moment. It's something that we've been talking about. But I think I've done it in other companies before. It's been really impactful if run well. But I think you have to really kind of set yourself up for success, spend some time building it, taking some feedback on board, and making sure that it's fit for purpose. Sometimes you can throw out a buzzword of mentorship programs or something like that, and everybody kind of latches onto it and says, okay, great, let's do that. It might not be the right thing for your business, it might not be what getting the results that you're looking for. So I think it's really important to look at what the business priorities are, and build your plan accordingly.
It reminds me, you mentioned in terms of the bandwidth sort of constraints that, most workers operate under in terms of actually finding the time to learn and adopt new skills, especially if, it's important because obviously a lot of those skills are extremely relevant. I mean, in your experience, do you find that, I mean, should companies make a point of sort of reserving time like within the day for people to kind of learn skills? I'm just thinking because, so many companies say to their workers, we want you to train, we want you to learn these skills, here are these resources, et cetera. But then everyone is still under the gun to deliver, within their 40 or 50 hours a week, everything they have to deliver. And then there's no time to actually learn despite the company making all those overtures to do so. And I'm just wondering, I mean, in your experience, because you've been, you've sort of seen the whole panorama of things, like what's sort of the best practical way for companies to actually get people in the seats learning while sort of balancing everything else out? Because it's a tough question.
Yeah, and I think it's really marketing it as learning. So like we're all learning every day. I'm learning during this podcast. I was learning on a meeting with our CFO earlier on. Like it's really important to kind of call it out as development and learning. Because I think people don't realize that on the job. Like doing their work, talking with other people, that is learning. So that's the biggest barrier that I see. When you're doing engagement surveys or you're sending out, pulse surveys, and what kind of, what have you done learning wise? When people say, well, nothing, I haven't done anything. And that's just because it's not in their kind of brain to think, oh yeah, no, that was a learning moment, or that was something that I was doing, or I was taking, the opportunity to meet with somebody in a different team to learn more about theirs. So it's not always traditional learning, I think. And it's hard to sometimes equate the two and for people to understand, okay, right, I did actually, I was learning. It's not always as simple as that, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it also kind of ladders up there. There's the idea of kind of creating a culture of learning where you encourage people to innovate and adapt and things like that. And I imagine, I mean, in addition to sort of the practical implementation that we've been talking about in terms of actually introducing courses and in terms of building out all this infrastructure, there's got to be also things that can be done culturally to kind of encourage that, I imagine, as well, like on the part of senior management and so on, to kind of to get that going. But what does that actually look like? I mean, what does it look like to have a learning culture?
Yeah, so I think like we use our business skills to structure and guide our work within the people function and the L&D team, and that helps us to kind of cultivate that learning culture, and look at things, and focus on skills and learning that's related to the business and to drive the business forward. So I think you have to connect your learning programs with the business goals and the overarching HR strategy, so that you can kind of be results orientated and make sure that learning initiatives are not only relevant but that they're really impactful as well. And I think that's the most important thing for us. And we've seen a huge increase in kind of a sense of belonging around that. And, for example, last year we had our competencies and skills development called out as a company OKR across the business, and we were checking in on that every quarter. So I think it's really kind of, practicing what you preach, not just putting it up there on a slide once a year and saying, oh, yes, we're very focused on learning, but really living that, and really kind of checking in on that regularly, showing progress, sharing that with the teams, I think is really important.
Yeah, it also seems like it would be a matter of trying to convince senior management that this isn't. It seems like anything that involves like the words training or learning or whatever, all of a sudden, your CFO and your CEO start getting really nervous about like, oh, what's this going to cost? And like, do
How's
we have
this much is going to cost me? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so like, what I mean, how can companies sort of convince organizations that in terms of ROI and so on, like learning and development initiatives, that this is actually an investment as opposed to a cost center or like kind of the first thing that's going to get cut when budgets get tight? I mean, it seems like that's a little bit of a conundrum just from my experience working with companies.
Yeah, for sure. So at LearnUpon and our customer success team implement something called results strategy with our customers. So this explicitly maps out how learning activities will contribute to achieving business outcomes. And so as customers here of our own platform, we also use that framework to measure our impact. So we look at things like retention rates for employees, exit survey data to identify trends. So, one thing that I've been looking at recently is, are fewer people leaving the company due to a lack of career growth opportunities, right? And what are people saying? So in last year, what were they saying? Is this year, is that number coming down, right? Are less people say using that as the kind of primary reason for leaving? And then in terms of engagement as well, we ask questions in our annual engagement survey and pulse surveys throughout the year, but really looking at the responses, reading those comments, looking at different cuts of the data, who participated in a pilot that we ran around skills development versus who didn't. Is there a difference? Are people kind of are seeing the benefits, and can we tie that back to the business outcomes as well? So yeah, I think it's really important to do that and to be able to show that. It's not always easy, because it is, HR has always been a cost center and always will be, I think. But trying to tie that more to the business outcomes and to say, okay, right, we can see a big gap here in terms of skills. Now we're going to take the next year, focus on that, and see can we improve that and ultimately help LearnUpon win.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, for example, we run the DICE tech salary survey every year where we ask people like what keeps them at companies and what leads to retention, why do they want to leave, et cetera. And training, it's funny because training is always the thing that tends to over index. The percentages are always super high. And yet we also ask those same tech pros when we're surveying them, like, do you actually have access to these resources or to these opportunities? And training is also the biggest delta between those who are the people who want it and those who are actually offered it within it. And it seems like such a slam dunk to for want of a better term, for companies to potentially input, to introduce training and learning and so on, and make those wins and make sure that people, especially like kind of the highly specialized tech professionals in AI and other kind of cutting edge things, actually stay in their seats. But it's also, I mean, at the same time, given there's a lot of budget tightening. There's a lot of, at least in the US, there's a lot of layoffs right now in terms of tech. And so, as I was saying before, it seems like L&D is one of those things that's always sort of on the proverbial chopping block to potentially get cut when companies are considering how to, kind of keep the operation high and tight. And I mean, I guess it leads to my last question, which is, what's the way that managers and even like individual employees can kind of emphasize and like kind of continue to push for L&D within their organizations, even if they're not necessarily in a position to make those kind of strategic decisions, because it's critical. I mean, and it's important. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think definitely even over the last kind of 5 years, L&D has become less of a nice to have and more of something that companies are really starting to understand. Okay, I can use this to my advantage, right? If I train up my people, if I upskill my people, they will want to stay here when times get better across the globe, and they'll we'll be able to kind of be more resilient as a business. So yeah, lots of tech companies have been going through layoffs or are going to be going through layoffs. And so it's really important to kind of show that we can add value on the L&D side in terms of retaining people, productivity and innovation as well. I think also like companies are going, if they're not doing layoffs, they're doing hiring freezes. And so internal mobility then becomes even more important because it's often more cost effective to reskill or upskill somebody than, to go out to the market and recruit new people. We've had a lot of success at doing that in our sales org, for example. So between kind of internal mobility between biz dev and sales. And then we've had a number of account executives make a transition successfully into our pre-sale solutions team. So, that's a huge amount of internal knowledge that helps them hit the ground running much quicker than an external hire would. And I think that's really important when you can tie that back and show the business, this is the value that we're bringing and adding. And then I think, since COVID, virtual learning has definitely become the norm. But it's important not to take a one size fits all approach. We use learning journeys internally, and making sure that kind of personalized learning journeys are available. We're enrolling employees in the right courses based on their role or department or even skill level. We're using it for our new manager training program, for example. So, we've lots of different levels of managers, senior managers, directors. So making sure that they all get kind of a version of the training that's aligned to what we're asking them to do and kind of the skills that they're going to need to do that job. So I think it's really important to, it's it's definitely something that people can say, right, well, maybe we don't need L&D, or we don't need to invest in L&D. But if you can tie that back and show the value, and the improvements that you're making across the business by, okay, right, we've taken this company or this team and we've developed these skills, and now they can, that's unlocked something huge across the business.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's incredibly critical. I just hope that more businesses kind of realize that, this
Absolutely.
is, especially since, that's something that when I've been talking to managers of various tech companies, something that's kind of popped up again and again is we're in a hiring freeze. So therefore training actually becomes a really good solution to kind of upskill people instead of, kind of bringing in those new hires. You just develop the portfolio of the people you have on board. So, I mean, it seems, what we were talking about before in terms of cost savings and so on, in terms of it not being a cost center, it seems like it should hopefully be an easy argument to make, but you never know. Well, that was an interesting discussion. Here are some quick takeaways. First, when it comes to learning and development, consider management and specialist tracks. Not all talented tech professionals are best suited for people management. To retain specialists and maximize their expertise, companies must create clear alternative growth paths, such as distinguished engineer or principal specialist roles. These paths should offer increasing responsibility, complexity, and compensation without requiring individuals to oversee teams. Managers should work with their team members to identify these diverse avenues for advancement and then implement the right training and learning support. Second, integrate learning directly into the daily work environment and make it practical. Managers should recognize that finding dedicated time for employee learning outside of core responsibilities is a major barrier. Companies and managers should explore ways to embed learning within the workflow itself. This could include encouraging on-the-job learning, for instance. Remember, collaboration, tackling new challenges, and even participating in meetings are learning opportunities. Consider piloting new learning initiatives with smaller teams first to refine them based on real-world feedback before a broader rollout, ensuring that learning is relevant and applicable to employees' day-to-day tasks. Third, link learning to tangible business outcomes. For companies, it's critical to move beyond viewing learning and development, or L&D as some like to call it, as merely a cost center. What does this mean from a management perspective? It means framing L&D initiatives as essential investments by mapping how training activities contribute to achieving key business objectives. You can also use data to demonstrate impact, tracking metrics such as employee retention rates, especially the reasons for leaving, engagement survey results, productivity improvements, and successful internal mobility. Being able to show senior leadership how L&D directly supports the company's strategic goals makes a case for continued investment, particularly during periods of budget scrutiny or even hiring freezes. Fourth, it's critical, and absolutely critical, to foster a visible culture of continuous learning. A true learning culture is more than just making resources available. It's about a company's leadership demonstrating a commitment to development and embedding it into the organizational DNA. Senior management and HR should align learning programs with overarching business goals and HR strategy, perhaps even incorporating competencies and skills development into company-wide objectives, such as OKRs if your company follows that. In that spirit, it's critical to regularly check in on progress, communicate successes, and visibly champion learning initiatives. This consistent practice shows employees that learning is a valued priority, encouraging them to actively engage in their own development and contributing to a more resilient and innovative workforce. There was a lot more in that discussion, of course, so give it another listen if you feel so inclined. Thank you for joining us, and remember, Dice is your best resource to find the tech talent you need to fill your open roles, and for tech pros, the best place to grow your tech career.